That game was absolutely not for the faint of heart, and I would dare go as far as to say it also wasn't for the strongest of heart either, because it was so ugly for such large portions of the game. I know the stats don't necessarily reflect that, but if you watched it, that was a really gritty game through and through. It was kind of reminiscent of the last time Indiana was good, where, the defense was doing the talking and walking, but I think that really is the beautiful part of it is you got to see pretty much what you were hoping to see, I think, in a lot of ways, where Indiana, a team that is just totally unified, one great, you know, seemingly all on one string entity, getting it done where they are beat in passing yardage. Sure, Beck does throw the interception there at the end, but they're beat in rushing efficiency. They were tied in yards, exactly tied, which is pretty funny. But, it's not too often you see a team have less passing and rushing yards and they win. So that is really fun to see. You know, I guess, they didn't have the less rushing yards, but less rushing efficiency, I should say. So, you know, definitely seems like they were beat in the ground and in the air, but you know what? They won the special teams battle, that's for sure. They have, the field goal makes and a little bit of a blocked punt touchdown, which is, always nice to have. So, lots of things that just, you know, edged them out. And it really was, about as good as you could hope for, despite not always being the prettiest thing to watch. How often do you see a national championship go down to the last drive, kind of the last play, you could say, with Beck? And, you know, there was opportunity there. It wasn't a good pass by Beck, I must say. That was just totally locked into the pre-snap stuff. But if this is, what it is for Miami now, it is a great thing. I don't think that's going out on a limb whatsoever to say, losing the national championship game is surely a huge, massive sting. I won't deny that, but you had plus 3,000 odds going into this game, and that seems dwarfed by the fact that Indiana was plus 10,000. I feel like this had to have been for sure one of the wonkiest preseason betting odd championship games we've ever seen, where plus 3,000 is pretty skim for percentages. That's 3% implied probability, 10,000, a lot lower than that. So the fact that these are the two title teams and, they earned it. You can't say that they didn't. So it is really great to see it. It was a game that I felt was, just so deserved, and that I did kind of have a bias for both teams, like I rarely do, where I just kind of root for both teams pretty wholeheartedly. I wanted Indiana to win, but Miami would have been an awesome story as well. So I wasn't going to be dissatisfied with anything. I think this game absolutely lived up to that, and then some, though, with, the Mendoza hit was a little bit rough, where you could make the argument that there was some roughing involved, but it kind of added to the beauty in a sense too, which is how ugly the game was to see him bloodied up, which was pretty funny. Not the most pleasurable thing for him, I'm sure, but in a situation where, not to look too far ahead, but Mendoza projected to go number one overall, people are a little bit skeptical of him, as far as number one overall picks go, it seems, but he showed that he absolutely is just an immense competitor, where this wasn't his best game. It certainly wasn't. This is definitely a low end Mendoza game for this season, but so many great moments. There were some wonky back shoulders in there that really, were earned by the receiver more so than they were a great throw, but he did give the opportunity when, the offense wasn't clicking, and sometimes that is needed. So it's hard to say how much that projects into what his stock ends up being, but it just is such a good Indiana win. And, I do feel bad for the Miami fans, the Miami players, etc. That is a brutal way to end, where, especially, Beck having been with Georgia, having, kind of a title acclimate of sorts, it seems like you want him in a situation, even if he's not necessarily the most talented quarterback, it seems like you want him in those moments. So to have a play where he just does make a pre-snap read and doesn't get off of it, even with the safety rotating, and then the corner just absolutely playing the part, given the help over the top, it is a little bit frustrating in that sense. But when you get him to transfer from Georgia, this is the pretty apex outcome. So it does look great. Bain and Messidor just absolutely, helping their causes far and away. I think the best edge duo in college. It, you know, is so daunting to see where, Bain being a projected top 5 pick. I know there's some concerns with his arm length, but, just an absolute dominant player. He just destroys linemen a lot of the time, not even, just like winning with hustle or anything. No, he just like throws them around, and you saw that in the run game a fair amount too. But and he can sometimes be outdone by Messidor on the other side. So that really was on display. That's disappointing for Miami that you don't reward that with a championship, but things definitely look up for them. They have a coach they finally feel good in, so that's the way I would hearten them. It is pretty pretty rough to see a lot of your key guys, going on to the next level, but it it was about as good as you could hope for. This really has them back on the map. You figure this is a sign of things to come. In Indiana, they have about as good of a situation as you could hope for now with Signetti, where you know no one could have ever seen this outcome. If they say otherwise, they're just lying to you. Indiana going into the year again plus 10,000 to win the Natty. This is just unbelievable. So he deserves all the praise. I know he does get talked about a whole lot, but I think that's deservedly so. So this is just, again, such a wonky, absolute weird disaster of sorts of game where, even looking at like the penalty situation, there was a lot of penalty yards. I think it was like about 100 in total, where it was like maybe like 60 for Miami and then like 40, I want to say, for Indiana, something like that. But they were in a lot of key spots too where, you know, the situation was pretty impacted. There were a lot of long third downs that ended up being, converted one way or another from penalties where, I think Bain was offsides on a 3rd and long, and then there's pass interference, I believe it was, on a 3rd and long as well. So, lots of things. The situation for Indiana was murky as well, where you're just helping them out with penalties in situations where you're feeling really good. So, not clean in any way. So it is funny to think that Indiana wins with, sort of the winning along the margins, the edges of sorts, which, seems like you just don't make mistakes. No, there were a lot of big, big mistakes that were just total gaffes, but, you know, getting that blocked punt was just such a big mover in a game where offense was hard to come by. A lot of the drives were just not going anywhere and looking ugly as they were doing it as well. So just an absolute huge mover there. And again, that is another thing that you can feel bad about if you're Miami, where, it feels like the game is just kind of taken away from you a little bit there with something that, isn't traditionally a way to, kind of lose a game. It obviously wasn't the only reason they lost. It was a fist fight regardless of the blocked punt. But, that is certainly not the way you want to lose. You at least want to lose on offense or defense, not really having the needle move so much by the special teams. But again, I love that for Indiana. It is pretty indicative of them where, it is just an ugly game. It really is. But, they find a way. And it was a lot of things on display that you wanted to see again, with Mendoza making some key throws, even if he wasn't great otherwise. And, a lot of it too, it wasn't entirely, but a lot of it too was just, again, the defensive line, the edges again for Miami just completely dominating, making things absolutely suffocated. In the run game, they were dominating, getting pressure every pass seemingly, but, the interior was making things murky as well for Mendoza. So the things you wanted to see were on display. Tony, just an absolute sensational game. Really disappointed for him that he doesn't get the Natty, but, all of the stars, I think they showed up in their own way, and a very balanced receiving situation in Indiana was is a little bit all over for them, which was nice to see. So if you went into this game with some knowledge of what to look for, I think you ended up seeing it, even if it wasn't necessarily in the cleanest of ways. Those are my thoughts on the national championship game. Be sure to let me know what yours are in the comment section. Be sure to like and subscribe. I'll be doing NFL content soon. I'll be doing basketball content. We'll be doing NFL draft stuff soon. So, got a lot of things planned. To be sure to be on the lookout for that. Subscribe with the notifications on, and also be sure to treat yourself like you would a friend.